Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for our study in, as you can see, the story of the Bible. We're just taking a 50,000-foot view of the big story, the big picture of the Bible, and using, Jonathan and I didn't invent this, but we borrowed it, the 17 Bible time periods. It's kind of a good way to be able to categorize, to put in a chronological order the time periods of the Bible. It's a good thing to put to memory so that when you're studying different parts of the Bible, or if the preacher, Bible class teacher is talking about some event or some character, you've got a place to put them on that timeline. And speaking of Jonathan, my name is Ken Chapman. I preach in Orlando, Florida. Our co-host is Jonathan Caldwell, who preaches for the church in Moody, Alabama. How are you tonight, Jonathan?
Doing all right. Just ready to see how you've organized this rather long section. After we covered one chapter last time, we're going to cover 39 this time?
Yes, we're going to be flying through. We talked about being at 50,000 feet. We're literally in that airplane at 50,000 feet flying through. And so we are looking at the fourth of our time periods, the patriarchal period. As Jonathan said, this is going to cover, and we'll see that in just a minute, cover several chapters of the book of Genesis. Brings us to the end of the book of Genesis. It's one of the most well-loved sections of Scripture because there's so many compelling characters and events, and such foundational characters and events that take place during this time period. We've looked at already the three periods before the flood, the scattering of the people, and now finishing up the book of Genesis with the fourth time period, the patriarchs. Now, as we move forward, again, period 4, the patriarchs, it covers, as Jonathan pointed out, several chapters in the book of Genesis chapters 12 through 50. And so a lot of ground covered in this one time period. And as you might expect, covers a lot of years. Through this time period. We're going to begin with the call of Abraham and conclude with the death of Joseph. And that gives us kind of a hint of who we're talking about when we're talking about these patriarchs, these father rulers. We have Abraham, his son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, and then I guess we'd have to kind of group the sons of Jacob in there. I don't know if you could put maybe just Joseph, isolate him, because much of the story, the narrative is going to revolve around him. But I think it would do injustice to the other sons of Jacob to just isolate on this list of patriarchs just Joseph. And so we'd include all the 12 sons of Jacob.
Well, you'll see as we go through it, and I think you may have this on a little bit of a later slide, the story seems to follow Joseph, but those promises, those blessings go with Judah. And so you kind of have the narrative go a little bit one direction. And so, yeah, I like this, this idea here, the sons of Jacob. And I don't think you have this in your slides, but you get this phrase throughout the whole book. These are the genealogies, or this is the family of that structure that comes throughout the whole book. And when you get to the end or towards the end, especially as the Joseph story starts, it's not, this is the story of Joseph, or this is the family of Joseph. This is Jacob's family. And so I think this is a very fair way to categorize it.
Yes, and to talking about those characters and stories, it's paramount that we remind ourselves through these long chapters in the book of Genesis that we're not really just looking at interesting characters and compelling stories. They are so compelling and so interesting that we can get drawn into the stories and the characters themselves and forget what the point is of why we are talking about this man Abraham and his wife Sarah, why this conflict between these brothers, Jacob and Esau, why the interesting roller coaster ride that is the life of Joseph. To forget that what we're really doing here is we're moving forward in the story of the Bible. And so in our study tonight, we're going to try to emphasize that. Now, I know you all love studying these biblical family trees and genealogies, but I really didn't know a better way to kind of shorten the story. We talk about the call of Abraham. Abraham, we're introduced to him. Now, I'm going to be using the name Abraham. When we're introduced to him, it's Abram, but we know him more famously as Abraham. He is in the Ur of the Chaldees. His father's name is Terah, and we're introduced to a man, Abram, Nahor, and Haran, the siblings. And then, of course, the son of Haran is Lot. And so here are our characters. And of course, Abram is married to his wife, Sarai. And then Haran dies at some point when we're in Ur of Chaldees. And then they move to a city that is just coincidentally named the same as his brother, Haran. And so moving to Haran are Terah, the father, Abraham, his wife Sarah, his brother Nahor, and his wife Milcah, and then nephew Lot, who's going to figure prominently later into our story. Abraham receives the call again. At some point in Haran, his father Terah passes away, and then Abram moves to Canaan. And as far as we know from the story, just these three characters that figure prominently, they would have been more people with them, but the three prominent characters that make the trip all the way from Ur of Chaldees to Haran to Canaan are Abraham, his wife Sarah, and of course, nephew Lot. And so this is kind of a three-stage journey, if you will, from Ur to Haran to Canaan, to that land that would become the land of promise. Now, if we look at this on a map, here's kind of probably the journey that we think, or at least the route that we think. And again, it would have originated here in Ur of the Chaldees. The family makes the trip up to Haran and then journeys down into the land of Canaan that is going to become the promised land. There is that excursion into Egypt briefly, and then back into the land of promise. And so here's the journeys of Abraham and the main characters that we run into this story. Now, what figures prominently early on and follows us throughout, not just the story of Abraham and not just the story of the patriarchs, but it's going to follow us all the way through to the New Testament, are what we sometimes refer to as the promises to Abraham. I've changed the wording a little bit and just refer to it as a promise. It's really just one big promise, one big multifaceted promise to Abraham. And so God, in making this call to Abram to come out and to go to this land that I will show you, God makes these promises in this one grand promise that his descendants would be a great nation. Now, remember, at this time, Abraham has no descendants, but his descendants would not only be great in number, but they would form a nation. That he, Abraham, would be blessed both materially and spiritually, that his name would be exalted, that he would be a medium or a conduit of blessings to others. And so it's almost like the blessings that God are going to give Abraham are so numerous that they just overflow and they touch whoever Abraham comes in contact with in a positive way. And that through his seed or his descendant, all families of the earth would be blessed, and that his descendants would receive the land that Abraham was sojourning in, and that is the land of Canaan. Now, I know you have studied this before, but we've kind of simplified that promise and boiled it down to three components. Makes it much easier for us to memorize: the nation, land, and seed promise. The nation, of course, promise is fulfilled when his family does become that great nation, takes on the name of his descendant, Israel, and become known as the children of Israel or the Israelites. They receive the land, that land of promise, is the land of Canaan. And so those two promises are going to be fulfilled in rather short order, speaking in perspective of the whole story of the Bible. And then the last promise, the spiritual promise, the seed promise, as we know as students of the New Testament, are fulfilled in the person of Christ. Paul makes that apparent to us in the New Testament. And so we have this big promise, many parts to it, but we boil it down for memorization's sake to these three components: the nation, land, and seed promise. Jonathan?
The interesting thing about these, one, is the more you study the Bible, and especially as we continue through these various time periods, you realize how absolutely essential these promises are to the rest of the story. And even as you get into the New Testament, especially as you get into like something like Romans, you see how fundamental Abraham and these promises become. But then also the likelihood of these things happening are so small. These things weren't going to happen on their own. We have Abraham in a nation that's not his. He's a foreigner in this nation, and God says, I'm going to give it to you. He doesn't have any children, and he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. He doesn't have any children, and God says, I'm going to use your descendants to bless the earth. And so we have these promises that at Abraham's age and where Abraham is in life, they look completely impossible. And yet God makes the promise, and further, Abraham believes it. Abraham is like, that sounds good to me. And so that's a pretty powerful thing, and an example for us to follow just out of the gate there.
I hope I'm not overstating this, but it seems that Genesis chapter 12 and the chapters following that, chapters 15, chapter 22, where we have these promises repeated and sometimes maybe clarified as they're given to Abraham again, is the pinnacle, really, in some sense, of the Old Testament. It's almost like the first 11 chapters of Genesis have been leading us up to this point. Through the generations, through the need through sin, and just every generation dying as a result of sin. And the rest of the Old Testament are going to be dealing with these first two promises, the nation and the land. Even when we get over to the prophets that close it out, it's all about God's dealing with this nation, and this nation trying to stay God's people and trying to stay on the land. And so the rest of the Old Testament is going to be dealing with the first two components of this promise, while still prophesying about that third component. And then, of course, the New Testament is going to be all about the fulfillment of this last spiritual. And so I don't know that we can overstate the importance of this promise and these chapters to the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible, in a sense, is just about the fulfillment of these promises and God dealing with this people, and then God fulfilling that promise that's going to be the answer to the problem that was introduced back in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis. And so we're going to be looking at the family of Abraham, and this is a crude illustration of kind of a family tree. You know that a family tree just begins to balloon or to expand, multiply exponentially. And so if we can think of this as being, this is Adam, the first generation, and that those generations would have just multiplied and multiplied until we have this reset down here at Noah. And it kind of starts over with the family of Noah. And again, these generations would have just expanded and expanded. But the story of the Old Testament is just going to be the story really of one branch in this ever expanding family tree. We're looking at the family of Abraham. And so though the Old Testament, the Bible in its entirety, but particularly the Old Testament, is historically accurate, it's not really a history book. It's not a history of everything that's going on in the world. There's thousands of families and of events and cities that we won't even hear about in the Bible. We'll hear about this one family in this grand expanding family tree from the time of Adam and from the time of Noah. We're just interested in this one family. Now, we may read about other people. We may read about the Egyptians and Pharaoh, but we really only read about them because they come in contact with this family. We'll hear about the Babylonians and a man like Nebuchadnezzar, but we only hear about him not because he's this important military ruler of his time. We read about him because he comes in contact with this branch of the family tree. And so let's remember that we're looking to have a very narrow focus when we look at the story of the Bible.
And what's funny is what you're saying is exactly right. But what's funny is we are sometimes shocked that there are other people who have a relationship and dealings with God. Because we're so focused on this Noah family, this Abraham family, this Judah family, that we're introduced to someone like Melchizedek, who's a priest of God. And we're like, wait a minute, there's someone else out there that, and then even Moses' father-in-law, Jethro or Ruel, is the priest of Midian and seems to fairly well be drafted into the grouping of Israel there. And so it's kind of funny, and I appreciate the warning there that this is all history, it's all accurate, but it's just one very specific slice of history.
Yeah, and the fact that something is omitted from this story is not cause for alarm. It's just, again, we have a very narrow focus in this story, and it's important to keep that in mind as we go. Now, here's kind of a timeline of Old Testament history that we looked at. And I think it's important to have a timeline and have these 17 Bible time periods maybe put to memory so that you can see where the story is going and how it flows together. We've looked at the creation. We saw there in Genesis chapter 3, the rise of sin entering the world. Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, Tower of Babel. Here we have sin and the results of sin creeping in and really just consuming mankind. And now beginning with this second layer, we have now beginning of the answer, the call of Abram. And we're going to have the story of Hagar and Ishmael, where, remember, God has promised that through you, all nations would be blessed, and in you is a great nation. Well, I don't have any children. And so Abraham and Sarah set about, maybe we sometimes say, to help God. But God lets them know right away, I don't need your help. I've got this. And so we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember Lot, the Abraham's nephew, that traveled with him all the way from Ur to the land of Canaan. He is embroiled in that destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah famously. And then finally, we have the birth of Isaac, the birth of that child who had been promised to Abraham and Sarah, and God saying, this is that son of promise. And then Isaac grows up, takes a wife by the name of Rebekah. And through them, two sons are born, in fact, twins, Jacob and Esau. And Esau, we say Jacob and Esau, but if we go in birth order, the prescribed birth order would be Esau and Jacob. But remember, Jacob becomes that kind of that supplanter in the story. He's holding on to the foot of Esau when he is born, and then ends up taking his birthright. And we remember all of those stories involved with that. And then we have Jacob marrying Rachel, eventually the one whom he loved, but because of the dealings of his father-in-law, he ends up marrying Leah first and then Rachel. And so we have Isaac. Here's some names we're going to want to put to memory: Abraham and Sarah, of course, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel. And then, of course, through Jacob, Rachel, Leah, and a couple other women thrown in there, we have the descendants of Jacob, the sons of Jacob, who will become basically the tribes of Israel. Jacob's name is going to be changed to Israel. And so instead of having the Jacobites, we have the Israelites, the sons of Israel. This is going to be the nation that was promised to Abraham, promised to Isaac, and then, of course, promised to Jacob. Then the remainder of the book of Exodus is consumed by the story of Joseph. Really an interesting story of the ups and downs of Joseph. He is sold by his brothers because of their jealousy. He is sold into slavery into Egypt. He rises to power, gets thrown in jail, rises back to power because of his interpretation, or really God's interpretations of those dreams through Joseph. And then famously, the famine begins. And it is that famine, and again, don't just get lost in this interesting story, but this is moving us forward. That famine is what brings the family of Israel, formerly known as Jacob, into Egypt, where they will sojourn for hundreds of years. And I liken it to God's almost like putting them in an incubator to grow. And they go there, they're isolated from these Egyptians, and they're just doing nothing but just growing. They're just multiplying and becoming a large enough body of people, not just to alarm Pharaoh, but a large enough body of people to be a nation. And so that's where we're leading to. And then, of course, the story of Genesis ends with the death of Joseph, with the promise and the prophecy, don't leave me here. When you leave, take my body, my remains with you. And so there's that prophecy, the remembrance of that promise made to Abraham, that through you or in you would be a great nation, and they will be the possessors of this land, the land of promise. And Joseph believes. His dying breath shows us that he believes Jehovah, he believes the promises, and of course we do too. And we look forward as we read this story to the fulfillment of those promises in Christ Jesus in the New Testament. Then let's just kind of close out by looking at the broader branch, if you will, of that family tree. All of this started in Ur of Chaldees with Terah and his son Abraham, and then Abraham's son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, and then we have these 12 sons. And we've highlighted in blue the family line of Jesus. Jesus will be a descendant. Remember the promise that we're still waiting when we end the book of Genesis and even in the book of Exodus to be fulfilled, is that through your seed, all families of the earth would be blessed. And of course, that's going to come through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah. And so there are the patriarchs. We have the beginning of this grand promise that is, again, the story of the Bible. And interestingly enough, that is the title of our study, the story of the Bible. And this is really encapsulated in this section of Scripture of what's going to be the story of the Bible, of remedying that problem of sin that we see in the first 11 chapters. Jonathan, any closing comments or complaints?
No, just you start with these promises made to Abraham, and by the end of the book, it actually seems like God's people are going in the wrong direction. God says, I'm going to give you this land, and at the end of the book, they wind up in Exodus or in Egypt. But that opens us to the next part of the story we'll talk about next week, and maybe God's greatest act greatest act of salvation until you get to the cross, as he brings his people out. And so, and it's often this way that the story of the Bible, the story of God, does not go as we would have written it. As we often expect it to go, but we see that God is in control, that he is the author of this grand narrative that we find ourselves a part of.
Reminds me of the hymn, In His Time.
Right.
And that you could sing that all through this, the book of Genesis and Exodus. In His time, God is saying, I've got this, Abraham. I know how to make children. I know how to make a nation. I'll do this. I know how to give them the land. I know how to redeem man from his sins through my son on the cross, but it's all in His time. So, well, thanks for joining us for this time in our Bible study. And we hope that you'll join us next Monday evening as Jonathan walks us through that story of salvation, the story of the Exodus. Thank you, and may God bless you.